Sarah Williams was used to making quick decisions her whole life. Whether it was in the office or on the go, she was always focused on the task ahead and never allowed distractions to veer her off course. But today, as she was driving through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, something caught her attention, or rather something didn't. She was rushing to an important meeting at the city hall, a meeting that could affect her department's future for years to come, and she had no time to waste. As she turned the corner onto a residential street, the gentle hum of her car's engine was the only sound filling the air. She didn't notice the posted speed limit signs that warned drivers to slow down, and before she knew it, she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. The moment her heart sank, it wasn't that she was doing anything particularly wrong. It was the sudden interruption of her carefully planned morning that unnerved her. The officer who approached her car was young and polite, asking for her driver's license and registration, and simply telling her she was speeding in a residential area. She sighed and handed him the necessary papers. It wasn't the first time she had been stopped for speeding, but she didn't expect this small moment to turn into anything more than a minor inconvenience. As the officer returned to his patrol car, she leaned back in her seat and mentally went over the meeting she was about to attend. It was a routine check-in with the mayor and several key city planners. They would be discussing long-term development plans for the city. Sarah knew her department's budget was on the line, and she had to ensure the proposed projects were approved. She had prepared meticulously for this moment. So when the officer returned and handed her a ticket for a significant fine, her thoughts immediately shifted from the meeting to frustration. She took the ticket and nodded politely, but as she drove away, she couldn't help but feel the sting of being penalized for such a minor issue. It wasn't the fine that bothered her, it was the principle behind it. It felt like a small brush with unfairness, the kind that could easily be swept aside, but also the kind that lingered in the back of your mind. By the time Sarah arrived at the city hall parking lot, her mind was still preoccupied with the ticket. She knew she would have to deal with it later, but for now there were bigger issues to focus on. As she walked toward the building, she put the thought of the fine aside and entered the meeting room, where the other city officials were waiting. She greeted them with a firm handshake and took her seat at the head of the table, ready to dive into the agenda her team had prepared over the past several weeks. They discussed budgets and proposals, each topic more important than the last, but in the back of Sarah's mind, the earlier encounter stayed with her just enough to make her feel unsettled, but not enough to throw her off track. As the meeting went on, she pushed the incident aside. She had more pressing matters to attend to, but little did she know the fine she received today would soon become much more than a fleeting annoyance. The following week, Sarah found herself back in the courtroom, a place she never thought she'd return to after the minor traffic violation. As part of the legal process, she had to appear to settle a fine from the speeding ticket. She walked into the courthouse with a sense of quiet resolve, knowing this would be a brief formality. She wasn't worried about the outcome, but she was irked that something so trivial had brought her here in the first place. The courthouse was modest, with polished wooden benches and the heavy scent of old books that lined the walls. It was early in the morning, and the room was already filled with a mix of local citizens and attorneys. The clamor of voices, as they prepared for their hearings, seemed distant to Sarah as she took her seat in the back, waiting for her case to be called. After what felt like an eternity, the bailiff called her name, and she stood up with the same composed air she always carried in professional settings. She was wearing a tailored suit, confident, poised, ready for whatever the court had in store. As she walked to the front of the room, her eyes briefly flickered to the judge's podium. There, seated with an air of authority, was Judge Robert Mitchell. He was an older man with a thick mane of silver hair, sharp features, and a stern expression that gave little away. She recognized him immediately as the same judge who had fined her for the speeding ticket. His presence in the courtroom made her feel uneasy, but she reminded herself this was a simple matter, something she would handle without much trouble. Judge Mitchell scanned the room and then fixed his gaze on Sarah, raising an eyebrow. "Ms. Williams," he began in a voice that was both deep and commanding, "you were caught speeding through a residential area. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" His tone was cold, almost dismissive, and it immediately set Sarah on edge. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, he continued, "It's clear that you broke the law, and I have no reason to believe you're unaware of the speed limits in this area." Sarah paused, her mind racing. This wasn't what she had expected. She had anticipated a routine hearing, perhaps a simple acknowledgement of the fine with a chance to explain herself. But Judge Mitchell was offering no room for explanation. He wasn't even acknowledging the possibility of a misunderstanding. His rigid stance on the matter was unsettling, especially considering the circumstances. "I understand the rules," she finally replied, her voice steady. "But I believe the fine is excessive for such a minor violation. I'm not disputing that I was speeding, but the amount seems disproportionate given the context." Judge Mitchell's eyes narrowed as he reviewed the paperwork in front of him, not even glancing up at her as he continued to speak. "Ms. Williams, you were speeding in an area where children are often present. The law is there to protect everyone, and your actions could have been dangerous." His words were firm, and Sarah felt a flash of frustration rise in her chest. He was treating her as though she had committed a grave offense, but the reality of the situation felt much less severe. It was a simple mistake, one that could have been resolved without fanfare, but here she was, standing in front of a judge who had already made up his mind. She didn't want to escalate things further, but the injustice of the situation gnawed at her. After a long silence, Judge Mitchell finally spoke again, his voice colder than before. "I'm imposing a fine of $500. Pay it within the next 30 days, or we'll need to schedule another hearing." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. $500 for speeding on a residential street where no harm had been done. She took the fine without comment, nodded curtly, and left the courtroom. Walking out of the building, she felt a knot form in her stomach. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle behind it. Sarah knew she had been unfairly treated, but there was nothing more to say. For now, she would move on. Or so she thought. Days passed after the court hearing, and Sarah tried to put the entire experience behind her. The fine was just a small hiccup in her otherwise busy schedule. However, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about the situation had been off. She was used to navigating the complex world of government projects, managing budgets, and leading her team with confidence. But this encounter with Judge Mitchell felt personal, a reminder of how easily power could be misused. She had accepted the fine, but deep down, she felt the sting of being judged so quickly and without understanding. On Monday morning, Sarah arrived at her office early as usual. The city's long-term planning project was in full swing, and there was a flurry of meetings scheduled for the day. She was the head of the department, responsible for ensuring that every piece of the puzzle fit together: public policy, community initiatives, city planning, and, most importantly, the city's budget. As she sat down at her desk and began reviewing the day's agenda, she was interrupted by her assistant, Jessica, who walked in with a few papers in hand. "Sarah, there's someone here to see you." "Judge Mitchell," Jessica said with a curious look. Sarah paused, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Judge Mitchell," Sarah repeated, raising an eyebrow. She hadn't expected to see him again anytime soon, certainly not here in her office. "Yes, he's here to discuss the community development initiative for the city. He says it's about the new infrastructure project we've been working on," Jessica explained. A mix of surprise and unease washed over Sarah, but she quickly masked it. She nodded at Jessica and straightened herself, putting aside her lingering frustrations from the court hearing. "Sent him in," Sarah replied, standing up to greet the judge. The door opened moments later, and Judge Mitchell stepped into her office. He was dressed in his usual formal attire, but now he appeared somewhat less imposing than he did in the courtroom. He had a clipboard in hand, his face slightly more relaxed. Sarah extended a hand in greeting, trying to keep her composure intact. "Good morning, Judge Mitchell. What can I do for you today?" she asked, her voice neutral. "Good morning, Ms. Williams," the judge said, shaking her hand with a firm grip. "I wanted to discuss the upcoming community outreach program. As you know, the courts are working closely with your department on the new infrastructure initiatives. I wanted to review the details of our collaboration." As they sat down to discuss the project, Sarah listened intently, trying to focus on the task at hand. The judge spoke in measured tones, offering ideas and feedback on the infrastructure plans. Despite the professional nature of the conversation, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. Here was the same man who had fined her so harshly, now sitting across from her as though nothing had happened. She tried to push the thought aside, but it lingered in the back of her mind. The more they spoke about the community development plans, the more Sarah realized that Judge Mitchell was not fully aware of her role in the city's leadership. He seemed to treat her as just another city planner, and she began to wonder if he even recognized her beyond the courtroom. She found herself searching for clues, wondering if he had any idea who she truly was. As their meeting continued, Sarah's suspicions were confirmed. The judge asked her about the specifics of the budget for the project, almost as though he were unaware of her position at the helm of the entire initiative. It was then that she realized he had no idea who she was. In fact, he probably didn't even remember her face from the court hearing, let alone recognize her as the person he had fined. Sarah couldn't help but feel a small sense of irony. Here she was, a key player in a major city project, a woman who was overseeing the entire initiative. Yet this judge, the same man who had just weeks ago treated her like a minor violation, had no clue that she was his superior. As the meeting continued, Sarah kept her composure, but a quiet part of her wondered, would he still have been so quick to judge her if he knew who she truly was? And what would happen when she revealed her position? Would his attitude shift? The meeting dragged on, and Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. Judge Mitchell continued to speak about the infrastructure project, his tone professional, but Sarah couldn't shake the lingering thoughts from earlier. She wondered if she should just let the matter go, but it was hard to ignore the irony. Here was a man who had judged her without hesitation, now sitting across from her without any recognition. Her mind raced, weighing the options. She could let it slide and continue discussing the project, but the more she thought about it, the more she felt the need to address it. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about the principle of fairness and how easily assumptions could cloud judgment, especially when people didn't even know who they were dealing with. The meeting finally slowed down, and there was a brief pause in the conversation as Judge Mitchell made a note on his papers. This was the moment. Sarah took a deep breath and, with as much composure as she could muster, decided to bring it up. She wasn't going to let it fester in silence. "Judge," she began, her voice steady but firm, "before we continue, I think there's something we need to address." Mitchell looked up from his notes, his expression mildly confused. "What is it, Ms. Williams?" "I couldn't help but notice that you haven't recognized me from the courtroom," Sarah said, choosing her words carefully. "You fined me a few weeks ago for speeding." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the judge looked genuinely puzzled. His eyebrows furrowed, and he blinked as though trying to place her in his memory. "Fined you?" he repeated slowly. "I'm sorry, I don't." "It was for speeding on a residential street," Sarah continued, her voice calm but direct. "I was in court that day, standing right before you. You fined me $500. It took a moment for the recognition to hit, but when it did, Sarah saw the color drain from his face. His eyes widened, and he glanced down at his notes as if searching for some way to make sense of the situation. You were the one?" he asked, his voice now filled with surprise. "I didn't realize. I didn't connect the dots." Sarah gave a small, almost ironic smile. "I wouldn't expect you to. But now that you do, I think it's worth acknowledging that I'm the head of the department overseeing this project, which we've been discussing." There was a brief silence between them. Judge Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing the gravity of the situation. He opened his mouth as though to offer an apology, but seemed to hesitate, unsure of how to approach the matter. After a moment, he cleared his throat. "Ms. Williams, He started, but Sarah interrupted him, her tone steady but resolute. "Judge Mitchell, I'm not upset about the fine," she said. "What concerns me is how quickly you judged me in that courtroom. It's one thing to issue a fine, but it's another to dismiss someone without fully understanding the context. You didn't know who I was, yet you acted as though the fine was the only thing that mattered. That's what I'm taking issue with." Judge Mitchell looked uncomfortable, his earlier confidence now replaced with an apologetic air. He shifted in his chair and finally spoke, his voice softer than before. "You're absolutely right, Ms. Williams. I didn't recognize you, and that was my mistake. I should have been more thoughtful. I acted too quickly, and I regret that." Sarah nodded, appreciating the honesty in his response, but still feeling the weight of the moment. "I know you're doing your job, but I just hope that in the future, you'll take a moment to consider the bigger picture. There's more to people than the roles they play in a courtroom or a traffic stop." For a long while, the judge said nothing, his gaze lowered as he processed her words. Finally, he looked up at Sarah, his face now more somber. "I understand," he said quietly. "And again, I apologize for my actions. I'll do better." Sarah met his gaze, and for the first time in their conversation, she saw something beyond the judge's usual stern demeanor. There was genuine reflection, even humility, in his eyes. The tension between them seemed to lift slightly, but Sarah remained cautious. This wasn't a simple fix. Respect and understanding would take time, but perhaps this was a start. With the tension somewhat diffused, they shifted back to the project. Sarah felt a new sense of clarity as they continued their discussion. She knew this was far from over. The power dynamics between them had shifted permanently, but the outcome was still uncertain. What mattered now was how they would move forward, not just as colleagues, but as individuals who had learned something important about fairness, judgment, and the complexity of human interactions. Over the next few days, Sarah found herself reflecting on the conversation with Judge Mitchell. It was clear that he was genuinely remorseful, and she couldn't help but admire the humility he showed in admitting his mistake. Yet part of her wondered if the encounter had truly shifted anything for him, or if it was just an apology meant to smooth over an awkward situation. Regardless, Sarah had no intention of letting the matter slide into obscurity. She was determined to hold him, and herself, accountable. At work, the focus shifted back to the city's development project. The stakes were high, with multiple teams involved and a tight timeline to meet. Sarah's mind was occupied with planning meetings, community outreach efforts, and logistics. But there was something subtly different about her interactions with Judge Mitchell. Since their discussion, she noticed that he seemed to approach their meetings with more respect, more thoughtfulness. It wasn't just about the infrastructure projects anymore. It felt like there was a genuine effort to build a productive partnership. One morning, as Sarah walked into the conference room for a meeting about the upcoming city planning event, she was greeted by Judge Mitchell, who was already sitting at the table. He looked up as she entered, offering a warm smile that was rare for him. His usual formal demeanor was softened, and Sarah found it surprising. He seemed to be making an effort to bridge the gap that had once existed between them. "Good morning, Ms. Williams," he said, standing up to greet her. "I've gone over the latest proposal for the new park. There are some excellent ideas in here." Sarah took a seat, surprised by how different their interactions felt. The usual stiffness had dissipated, replaced by a professional ease she hadn't expected. As they began discussing the park's design, Judge Mitchell spoke with genuine interest, asking insightful questions and offering suggestions based on his knowledge of community involvement. For the first time, Sarah felt that he truly saw her as a collaborator, not just a subordinate. And yet, there was still a part of her that wondered if this shift was sincere or simply a result of the awkwardness of their previous encounter. She knew that actions would speak louder than words, and she wasn't ready to let him off the hook just yet. As the meeting progressed, Sarah made it clear that the projects they were discussing were part of a much larger plan for the city's growth. She emphasized the importance of community input and the need for all officials, judges, planners, and city leaders to work together to create a future that benefited everyone. Judge Mitchell nodded thoughtfully, taking notes as she spoke. When the meeting concluded, Sarah was the last to leave the room. As she stepped into the hallway, she found Judge Mitchell standing by the door, waiting for her. She paused, unsure of what to expect. "I just wanted to thank you again, Ms. Williams," he said, his voice steady. "Your leadership and the way you've handled this whole situation, it's been a real eye-opener for me. I'm learning a lot, and I appreciate your patience." Sarah smiled, but there was still a part of her that held back. She hadn't forgotten the way he'd acted in the courtroom, nor the way he had initially dismissed her without a second thought. His words were kind, but actions spoke volumes, and Sarah wasn't going to let him off too easily. "I appreciate your words, Judge Mitchell," she replied, her tone firm yet fair. "But I also hope this serves as a reminder for us both. It's easy to make quick judgments based on assumptions. It's far harder to take a step back and truly understand the bigger picture. I hope you remember that moving forward." He nodded in agreement. "I will. I promise. Thank you again, Ms. Williams." With that, they parted ways, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. She wasn't sure what the future held, but something had shifted between them. Judge Mitchell had shown genuine growth, and that was something Sarah could respect. She wasn't looking for quick fixes or empty apologies. What mattered was the potential for real change in both their professional relationship and the work they were doing together. As Sarah left the building, she felt a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about a personal victory. It was about making a difference in how people approach one another, how power and judgment could be tempered with understanding. It was a small step, but a step nonetheless. And for Sarah, that was enough. As the weeks passed, the development projects Sarah was overseeing began to take shape. The city's infrastructure initiatives were moving ahead, with growing community involvement and increasing support from various local agencies. Sarah had managed to balance her responsibilities at work with the ongoing interactions with Judge Mitchell, who, to her surprise, continued to engage in a more thoughtful and collaborative manner. Despite their earlier tension, their professional relationship was blossoming into something more productive than she had anticipated. One Thursday afternoon, Sarah received a call from the mayor's office. The mayor had requested an urgent meeting to discuss an unexpected issue that had arisen in the ongoing city development plans. As soon as Sarah arrived at the mayor's office, she was briefed on the situation. A group of residents had voiced concerns about the impact of one of the planned parks on their community, specifically regarding its proximity to a historic landmark. The controversy had caught the attention of local media, and the mayor was concerned that it could affect the project's approval. "Sarah, I need you to help us navigate this. The public trust is key here. We need to find a solution that doesn't compromise the integrity of the project, but also addresses the community's concerns," the mayor said, his voice urgent but calm. Sarah listened carefully, taking in all the details. She knew this was a delicate issue, one that required both empathy and a firm hand. The mayor left her with a clear directive: find a way to engage with the community and resolve the matter before it escalated further. As she walked out of the office, Sarah immediately began forming a plan. She'd been through similar challenges before and knew that the best approach was always to listen first and act thoughtfully. The first step was to arrange a town hall meeting with the residents to address their concerns directly. Sarah knew that the success of the entire project hinged on transparent communication. She would need to ensure that the people felt heard and that their worries were acknowledged. The town hall was scheduled for the following week, and Sarah began preparing for the event. She carefully crafted a presentation that addressed both the history of the landmark and the benefits of the new park. The key was to strike a balance between preservation and progress, something that would allow both to coexist without compromising the integrity of either. On the day of the town hall, Sarah arrived early at the community center where the meeting was being held. The room was filled with a mix of local residents, some of whom were vocal about their concerns, while others sat quietly, waiting to hear what Sarah and the other officials had to say. As she walked to the front of the room, she noticed Judge Mitchell standing by the door, quietly observing. She wasn't sure if it was coincidence or if he had been sent as part of the mayor's strategy to lend his support, but his presence added a layer of tension. She hadn't expected to see him here, but she quickly reminded herself that this was about the community, not personal dynamics. The meeting began, and Sarah took the microphone, addressing the crowd with her usual calm authority. She spoke about the importance of the new park, highlighting how it would benefit the entire community, providing green space, recreational areas, and a safer environment for families. She acknowledged the residents' concerns about the proximity to the historic landmark and explained that the development team was committed to preserving the integrity of the site while enhancing the area's overall appeal. As Sarah spoke, she noticed Judge Mitchell nodding in agreement with her points. He hadn't said a word yet, but his presence seemed to lend weight to her arguments. When the time came for questions, a few residents raised their hands, voicing their concerns. Sarah listened attentively to each one, addressing their fears with empathy and offering practical solutions. When she finally paused for a moment, Judge Mitchell stood up. "I'd like to speak for a moment," he said, his voice calm but firm. He addressed the crowd with a sense of gravitas that only a judge could carry, but this time there was no hint of superiority in his tone. "I understand the concerns raised today. This is an important issue, and I know that the city has made efforts to balance progress with preservation. I've had the opportunity to work with Ms. Williams and her team, and I can say with confidence that they're committed to finding a solution that respects our history while improving our future." His words seemed to resonate with the crowd, and there was a shift in the room. The tension eased, and more residents began to speak, offering suggestions rather than complaints. Judge Mitchell's endorsement, albeit subtle, seemed to lend credibility to Sarah's efforts. By the end of the town hall, the mood had shifted dramatically. While not every concern had been fully resolved, the community seemed more open to the development. Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment. The meeting had been a success, and it was clear that the project would move forward with a greater sense of understanding from the public. As she left the community center that evening, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Not only had she managed to navigate a challenging situation, but she had also seen firsthand how collaboration and respect could transform even the most tense moments into opportunities for progress. Judge Mitchell, once a figure of judgment in her life, had now become an ally, one who, perhaps, had learned just as much from this experience as she had. The success of the town hall had left Sarah with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that balancing the needs of the community with the demands of the city's development was no easy task, but it was one she was willing to tackle head-on. The support from the residents, particularly after Judge Mitchell's endorsement, had given her the momentum she needed to push the project forward. There was still a long way to go, but Sarah felt confident that they were on the right track. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Judge Mitchell continued to work closely on the city's development projects. Their professional relationship, once strained by a tense encounter in the courtroom, had evolved into a genuine partnership. Judge Mitchell had proven himself to be more than just a figure of authority. He had become an advocate for collaboration and community engagement. His contributions during meetings were thoughtful, and his understanding of the complexities of urban planning had grown. Sarah, too, had been surprised by how much their partnership had changed. She had initially assumed that their differences in position and experience would create an insurmountable barrier, but instead, their shared commitment to the city's future had brought them closer together. It wasn't just about the logistics of the projects anymore. It was about making a real, lasting impact on the lives of the people they served. One afternoon, as Sarah sat in her office reviewing a new report on the park's design, her phone rang. It was the mayor's office again. Sarah braced herself for another urgent request, but when she picked up, she was surprised to hear an unfamiliar voice. "Ms. Williams," the voice said, "this is David Harris. I'm with the City Council. I need to speak with you about an important matter regarding the park development project." Sarah's curiosity piqued, and she agreed to meet with him later that afternoon. As she made her way to the council office, she wondered what the issue could be. Everything had been progressing smoothly with the community outreach, and there hadn't been any new complaints. What could be causing the sudden urgency? When Sarah arrived at the council office, she was led into a conference room where David Harris, a city councilman, was waiting. He was a middle-aged man with a stern expression and a reputation for being politically savvy. Sarah sat down across from him, sensing that this conversation was going to be more complicated than she had anticipated. "Ms. Williams," Harris began, "I'm sure you're aware of the pushback we've been getting from certain members of the community about the park development. There are some groups who are concerned that the project is moving forward too quickly, without sufficient consultation with all stakeholders." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "I thought we had addressed those concerns at the town hall." The community seemed to be on board with the revised plans. Harris nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. There are still some influential voices who feel that the project is going to displace local businesses and change the character of the neighborhood too drastically. These concerns are starting to gain traction, and there's pressure from some city council members to reconsider certain aspects of the project. A sinking feeling settled in Sarah's stomach. The community had come a long way in supporting the project, but it was clear that there were still powerful factions who weren't fully on board. She had expected challenges, but she hadn't anticipated the political games that might be played behind the scenes. "I understand the concerns," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "But we've done everything we can to involve the community in the planning process. We've held multiple meetings, revised plans based on feedback, and even adjusted the scope of the park. We can't keep delaying progress because of a small minority that's afraid of change." Harris leaned forward, his tone more serious. "I'm not saying you haven't worked hard, Ms. Williams, but you need to understand the bigger picture. There are powerful interests in this city that want to ensure that development benefits certain groups. If you push forward too quickly, you might end up alienating the very people you're trying to help." Sarah felt a wave of frustration wash over her, but she kept her composure. It was clear that this was less about the park itself and more about the politics surrounding it. She had dealt with political maneuvering before, but this felt different. The stakes were higher, and there was more at risk than just the approval of a development project. "I've been working with Judge Mitchell and other key figures in this city to ensure that the development is inclusive," Sarah said firmly. "We've balanced progress with preservation, and we're committed to creating a space that benefits everyone. If the City Council wants to revisit aspects of the plan, I'm open to suggestions, but we cannot afford to let politics derail this project." David Harris sat back, watching her carefully. "I'll take your message to the council," he said slowly. "But be prepared for some tough discussions ahead. This is far from settled." As Sarah left the council office, she felt a renewed sense of resolve. She wasn't about to let political games stall the progress they had worked so hard to achieve. She knew that the next phase would be challenging, but she was ready. This project wasn't just about buildings or parks, it was about improving the lives of the people she served, and no amount of political maneuvering was going to stop her from making that happen. As she walked down the hall, Sarah spotted Judge Mitchell standing near the elevator, waiting for his next meeting. She approached him, and he gave her a questioning look. "Everything all right?" he asked. Sarah nodded, her expression determined. "We've got a new set of challenges ahead, but I'm not backing down. We'll work through this." Judge Mitchell gave a small smile, his respect for Sarah growing with each passing day. "I'm with you," he said. "We'll get this done." With that, Sarah walked out of the building, knowing that despite the obstacles ahead, she was not alone. She had the strength of her convictions and the support of those who believed in the project's potential. The weeks that followed were some of the most challenging of Sarah's career. The political opposition to the development project grew more intense, with certain city council members rallying against the park's location and the changes it would bring to the neighborhood. It seemed as if every day brought a new meeting, a new set of challenges to navigate, and more voices demanding compromises that could undermine the entire plan. But through it all, Sarah remained steadfast. She had come too far to let politics and opposition derail everything she had worked for. Judge Mitchell remained a constant ally, and his support during this difficult period proved invaluable. As the pressure mounted, Sarah knew that his experience in the courtroom, his sense of fairness, and his ability to navigate complex situations would help her keep the project on track. Their meetings had grown more frequent, and with each discussion, Sarah felt a deeper sense of trust in him. The dynamic between them had evolved from a distant professional relationship to something closer, one built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to doing what was best for the city. One afternoon, as Sarah prepared for another city council meeting, she received an unexpected call. It was the mayor, and his tone was unusually serious. "Sarah, I need you to meet with me right away. There's a new development with the project, and it's not good." Her heart sank. What happened? "The opposition has gathered enough votes in the council to delay the park's approval," the mayor said. "They're using the historic landmark as leverage, claiming the park will disrupt the neighborhood's culture. it's going to be a tough battle. Sarah's mind raced. She had anticipated challenges, but this was a full-on roadblock. The council was now aligned against the project, and unless she could change their minds, the park was as good as dead. It felt like everything was unraveling. "Meet me at the office in 30 minutes," the mayor instructed. "We need to strategize." When Sarah arrived at the mayor's office, she found him pacing back and forth, looking more stressed than she had ever seen him. The weight of the situation was obvious in his demeanor, and Sarah knew this was going to take every ounce of determination she had to overcome. "We need to present a new approach, something that can win the council's favor," the mayor said. "I'm thinking we might need to make concessions to the opposing groups. Maybe reduce the park's size or adjust the design. Something to show that we're listening." Sarah listened carefully, but deep down, she knew that the heart of the project couldn't be compromised. Reducing the park's size or altering its design wouldn't fix the problem. It would only weaken the vision they had set out to achieve. "I don't think that's the right approach," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We've worked too hard to get this project right. Making concessions will only send the message that we're backing down. What we need is to change the narrative. We need to remind the council and the public of what this park truly represents." The mayor raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking about it," Sarah continued, her mind racing. "This project isn't just about creating a park. It's about investing in the future of the city. It's about building a space that brings people together, a place for future generations to enjoy. The opposition is focusing on fear, on preserving the past. We need to shift the conversation to progress, to how the park will benefit the community in ways that go beyond just a few vocal opponents." The mayor nodded slowly, clearly considering her words. "So you think we need to sell it differently? Focus on the positive impact rather than just addressing the concerns." "Exactly," Sarah said. "We need to show the council how the park will strengthen the community. We can bring in experts, local businesses, community leaders, people who are on board with this. We can show them that this park isn't just about development, it's about preserving the future." The mayor looked at Sarah with a new sense of understanding. "I like the way you're thinking. Let's make that happen. I'll arrange a special session with the council, and we'll bring in everyone who supports this project. We'll get the public involved too. If we can generate enough momentum, we can turn this around." It was a gamble, but it was their best shot. Over the next few days, Sarah worked tirelessly to rally support from local leaders, businesses, and residents who backed the park. She arranged for experts to speak at the council meeting, highlighting the environmental and economic benefits of the project. Sarah made sure that the narrative was clear. This park wasn't just about building something new. It was about enhancing the city's future, honoring its diverse history while embracing progress. The day of the special council meeting arrived. The atmosphere in the chamber was tense, with the opposition prepared to make their case. But Sarah stood tall, knowing that this was the moment they had been preparing for. When it was her turn to speak, she addressed the council with unwavering confidence. She spoke of the park's vision, the way it would bring together families, boost local businesses, and provide a much-needed green space in a growing city. She acknowledged the concerns, but she framed them within the context of progress, a city that respected its past while building for its future. She talked about unity, about the importance of creating spaces where everyone, regardless of background, could come together and share in the benefits of the city's growth. Judge Mitchell, standing beside her as a key supporter, spoke next, echoing her sentiments and reinforcing the importance of the park for the community's long-term well-being. By the end of the meeting, the tide had turned. The council voted overwhelmingly in favor of moving the project forward. The opposition had been silenced by the strength of their message, and Sarah knew that they had won not just the approval of the city council, but the support of the people. As Sarah walked out of the council chambers that evening, she looked at Judge Mitchell, who offered her a small but proud smile. Their journey had come full circle. From an adversarial encounter in the courtroom to a powerful partnership, they had worked together to ensure the city's future was brighter than ever. And in that moment, Sarah realized that the true victory wasn't just about the park. It was about the way people had come together, overcoming differences and embracing the idea.